What's up, Power Painters? This is Taylor Payton of tapeart.com and powerpainters.org coming to you today with another Power Painters video. So in this video, we're going to talk about some more drawing tips. I know you guys love those drawing tips, and so I'm aiming to deliver those tips this time in the format of detail and texture. So whenever you're drawing something and getting ready to create and separate elements, one way to do that is through detail, and another way to do that is through texture. And as you'll see, they are fairly synonymous in this process. And as I sketch in the focal point of this composition, it's pretty much just this sun-inspired tribal mask, for lack of a better idea. And I just wanted to have a figure with a strange piece of headgear on, essentially. And I knew that that would be the focal point, and thus I spent some good time there detailing it, working from the focal point outward and extrapolating where elements might go or pieces might start showing up, really. And then a lot of that is just extrapolating the anatomy and exploring the concept that I'm trying to manifest as I'm drawing it. It's important to start thinking of themes, even if it's just a sketch initially, because that will guide the rest of the process. And so I knew I wanted him to be a drummer, and I knew I wanted some tribal elements. I thought that those would be cool things to sort of fuse and bring out. I was thinking of like all the various masks of indigenous cultures and how rhythm is pretty much the core of a lot of musical concepts, and I thought that'd be nice to incorporate those things in and on the picture plane. So at this point, I'm still kind of conceptualizing, figuring out where the elements are going to go, especially the limbs, since I'm just working on a figure right now and I don't have a lot of context for what's going on outside of that guy. Um, I end up kind of moving the legs around a little bit, and this is a about a 1 hour piece sped up that you're watching. So before I started adding too much texture or detail, I knew I still had to start laying in compositional elements, which means figuring out what large shapes I want to have surrounding and giving context to the figure, even if it's not completely representational and I'm working out every single aspect of the perspective and it's meant to be very grounded in reality. It's not really moving along those lines. It's much more surreal and flowing and just about incorporating ideas. It's not going to be a real scene, it's going to be a more whimsical kind of set, if you will. If you're thinking about it in terms of a set, it's much more abstract than trying to give the context of a more realistic background. In terms of the texture I'm bringing in at this point, I'm just kind of playing with the breakup of the drum, a little bit of the detail within his core, the low body fat showing musculature and bone. Those are the details that start to work themselves in earlier in this process, and then we get a little more heavy and textural. So we just amplify the frequency of those details until they're more compressed on the picture plane, more compact. Everything has a lot of room to breathe within the silhouettes right now, within the main elements or components. And when we get more intricate, then we'll start to compress some of that to certain areas we want to draw the eye to or to separate them in particular, because it's a good way to separate things since we're not using values in this case. This piece could be brought further at the very end and separated with values, which I talk a lot about in the beginner drawing course, the beginner painting course, just using those basic value separations to get the different elements to read. It's sort of like a coloring book, but grayscale, essentially. Things are already outlined, we just got to apply, something that's bright or dark to it. The next thing is amplifying some of the energy. So I'm taking those compositional elements from before, thinking of other ideas and pulling those outward as well, like having him be like the center of a flower. His head is not just like a sun, it's also maybe a flower, and that could blossom out from that point because you always look into the center of the flower. It's just like that's the thing that draws you in, is that cup. And it usually has like some intricate center. I haven't actually studied what the names of these pieces are, so it's hard to describe them verbally, but it'd be worth, picking up some sort of, I don't know, glossary for that. But anyway, what I'm doing is just trying to get those naturalistic elements in there because those are going to be good for filling in the space. There was a lot of room around him after I squeezed him down, and so I wanted to bring that room to order with certain pieces and components. And like I said, they sort of have a natural vibe. There's a mushroom, there's what is like a symbol with some wind, some sort of like a lifting element beneath him, and then you have these other things that will appear in terms of the frequency. Everything gets a lot more detailed and separated, but that will be later in the process. For now, it's just going over some of those lines again, figuring out what needs to pop now because we're starting to separate those elements and starting to think more texturally for that separation. And a lot of that is going to come down to just adding to those elements, bringing out more detail in them, and thinking of a texture while bringing that detail out so you have a motivation for it. For example, the concentric sort of C shapes that are blossoming out from where he's sort of seated, those are inspired by like ribbons as well as the once again the core component of certain flowers like a rose. It's sort of interesting the motion and the way that things blossom and open up, and since we're already working in that direction or vein, we want the piece to flow in a certain compositional direction. So there's flow coming out from the head, and then there's flow coming out from beneath him, and those are two separating elements that push that character forward and give him sort of a backdrop. And again, I'm thinking of it like a set. Like if I were to dress somebody up in this attire and it was a music video or something, and the large scale flower thing could just be like a huge curtain or some other big piece that was built for the production, and that would just sort of frame everything up nicely. And then the stuff he's sitting on would probably have to be effects. If it were translated into real life, there'd have to be some sort of special effect or some weird pillows made out of it or something. But yeah, just thinking of what objects it could be or you could relate it to in the real world will help you get that texture and that separation and that detail. Here's where we go sort of haywire with the texture. And I mean, haywire in that frequencies are going to be generated. There's going to be some visual noise added to things that were otherwise fairly simplistic. And so I'm just pushing out a lot of detail around that headpiece because it's going to allow me to have another degree of separation when I start weighting the lines like this. The weighted lines will give it order, while the inner part will give it noise and more of that texture. And if I was going to work on this piece longer, I'd be much more careful about this process. Say if I were doing this in pen and I only had one go, I would really just zoom in and spend several settings and hours over it, whereas this is more of a 1 hour deal. So I just wanted to get the idea across, and so the technique is not as crisp as it could possibly be, but that's just a matter of zooming in and really putting the time in. You know, it's not as hard of a technical thing. It's just what are you aiming to do with this particular workflow. So here we get some kind of Day of the Dead or Sugar Skull inspired designs going on in the face, which gives it again more noise, more texture, an interesting element of separation. And we start to put in texture on those petals that were coming up from the flower that give it some more motion, some more of a flow again. And that flow is echoed in those sort of pieces beneath the figure as well. And here I am trying to put on some piercings or add some other interesting elements to give the figure more dimension, more pop, and kind of rounding out the largeness of that headpiece, because that's still a big shape even though there's a lot of detail in it. And so I want to kind of mold and sculpt that shape using the perimeter and the contour of things. So yeah, at this point you can see the different textural separations, the different detail oriented places that help to give, different contrasts to the elements that exist on the picture plane, whether that is the headpiece, whether that's the drum, whether those are some of the parts of the flower. It's just a matter of using those. If you're thinking mostly in line, then you just switch over to mark making and you start to make marks that create and build up texture. And then I'm going over a lot of the different aspects of the figure with thicker lines just to help separate a lot of the things I'm doing because there's a lot going on. And in terms of getting that to read in all the places, I've really got to pay close attention and squint a lot and see where things are coming forward and where things are pushing back and amplify those things by running over the line some more and kind of really softly sculpting the contours so that they begin to create this effect of form turning. And this is a technique that takes a long time to get really good at. It's difficult to turn form just by sculpting lines and building up various thicknesses that have subtle, nuances around the concave and the convex parts. And it's really about, again, getting dimensionality, but also having that finesse. And that's something that will take a long time to build up in terms of draftsmanship, and I'm still working on it myself. And again, it just takes a lot of focus and concentration and confidence to actually get those marks down the way that you're trying to get them to read. So at this point, I'm fairly pleased with the separations, not only texturally, but in terms of contour, in terms of pushing that dimension. Again, squinting really helps to see what parts are more thick and have inferred occlusions and shadows, ah, which could be a really nice way to work, just ensuring that you have these separations where you intend them to be and thinking always in terms of light and shadow. Even if there are no actual lights and shadows on the picture plane yet, we still have to have some resemblance of these elements in order to discern form, in order to demarcate form. And this is a very line heavy approach, but principles that we're thinking about in terms of overall picture making still apply, even when you're stripping down your tools and using them pretty in a pretty cohesive fashion. So a lot of the process that you cultivate for your own work is going to be based upon several different tools, right? Those tools could be the way you do your lines, or the way you add texture with mark making, or how you apply values. All these ways that you use the tools and the fundamentals are going to be unique, but I still recommend that you take the time to get to know each one individually. It's like when a carpenter knows how to utilize their hammer in such a way that they hit nails with great efficacy, right? They're not going to waste a lot of time smacking nails diagonally into the board because they've spent their time with just a hammer, nails, and wood. And those three things they've gotten very good with. So then they can move on to other elements and mastering those, like the circular saw or whatever. These are all just different ways of getting to the result, which is the creation of something, which is the making of an image. So once you get to know your tools, and I lay tons of them out in the beginner drawing course, and the beginner painting course as well for painting oriented tools, switching your mindset and your modality for that particular medium, then it's just really, really fun because you open up these possibilities for creativity. And I always say it, I stole it from John Mayer's talk at Berkeley, you need the information to express your inspiration. And that's what I want to provide for you, is the ability to see new things, to create new things, to look at your tools differently, and to take them and broaden and also deepen your abilities. So a lot of this has just been a matter of reading for me from the masters, dissecting their techniques, learning from people who are way better than me, and absorbing it into my own kind of whirlpool of artistic potency. So, speaking of whirlpools, I kind of wanted to echo some of the whirling shapes in the lower left part of the picture plane, and to use some very organic, kind of vegetable-esque cylindrical shapes for some of those lower right elements. And this way we still get to play with that naturalistic look. All the things are more or less laid in on the picture plane now, and it's used that detail and texture to make sure that your eye focuses upward. That's where most of it is. If you look at this whole entire image, you're going to go to that face first because it's got the most contrast, it's got the most texture, it's got the most detail, and there's no shape that's quite like it, even though there's some noise and some frequency on the picture plane. I made sure not to make the same kind of marks in those places as I did up toward that whole head mask region. Lastly, what I will say about this is I really did enjoy trying to bring out these interesting elements with just the tool of line, with just the abstract notions of rhythm and indigenous life and culture. And then I'll duplicate the lines after merging everything down in a folder, which is a technique I use a lot just to compress stuff and make edits that are easier because I end up with a lot of layers. And that's basically the whole technique. I just go in and clean up some of the elements now. I may revisit this later and redraw this now that the elements are in place, because this is just a 1 hour sketch. You can go way in depth with this process and create super clean, super succinct lines. There's still some drawing things I'd probably iron out as far as like the legs go, as far as some of the elements, but overall I feel confident that this was a helpful exercise in parsing a good deal of those pictorial sort of challenges, especially when it comes to less representational material. And again, the ability to do this comes from the tools which I have imbued in my courses for you, which I have imbued in the videos on this YouTube channel. And if you want, you have complete access to all of those things. You can check out powerpainters.org or tapeart.com, and there is some great stuff there for you. You have the courses, you have a lot of articles on powerpainters.org in particular, and that should serve you well moving forward. Of course, I always welcome your questions as well, or your feedback or ideas. I have some other things I'm going to be jumping on once I'm done making just drawing videos for the next 8 or so videos. I'm going to switch gears and start back on the painting route, and I'm just going to keep playing with stuff until we figure out what kinds of content people are really looking to see today. Because in my sort of sporadic upload schedule and going into different domains, particularly as I mentioned before, music and sometimes business or other areas, I don't quite know what to build in a particular niche. There's a lot of people doing similar things, and you don't want to compete. When you're a creative, competing is not ideal unless you have a really, really competitive streak and you got started early and you really want to beat people out for positions and scarcity in jobs. The way I like to play it personally is to create, is to become the only thing in your category and yet draw people in. And we'll talk more about that later. I'll definitely touch on that subject in further videos, so look out for those. Again, right now it's going to be mostly about technical, interesting things when it comes to drawing, but I'll cover all this moving forward with the videos. Thank you for all of your support. Much love. Feel free to leave me questions, comments, etc., and check out all the cool stuff in the description box. This has been Taylor Payton of tapeart.com and powerpainters.org, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care, Power Painter.